Welcome to the Debunking Economics Podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, and today the US trade war. Maybe, just maybe, we are at the first stages of a détente on that trade spat between the US and China, provided China buys tens of billions of dollars worth of American agricultural products and makes some concessions on protecting American intellectual property. But really, are they just agreeing not to make things worse? Meanwhile, industrial production in both countries is on the slide, and the impact of the slowdown in demand is being felt across the globe. So, can anyone win in this trade war between the US and China? That's today on the Debunking Economics Podcast. Well, we have talked about the trade war between the US and China before, and how, to an extent, President Trump is right to feel put out about the way in which China operates. The fact that companies need a Chinese partner to operate within their country, and how that's being used for intellectual property theft, allegedly. And perhaps it's also unfair how the state subsidizes companies in ways that the US doesn't want to do for themselves. Of course, we shouldn't argue with what the US president says anyway. After all, he has tweeted in this last week how he has a great and unmatched wisdom. But today, let's look at the impact and what it's having and why, and whether this war is sustainable. It's certainly having an impact on the economy. Kristalina Georgieva, the new head of the IMF, said that the trade war, through market reactions and its impact on confidence, could mean a loss of around $700 billion, or about 0.8% of the global domestic product by 2020, which she says is approximately the size of Switzerland's entire economy. So, Steve, politicians, economists, analysts, academics, everyone is saying nobody wins in a trade war. So are they right, or can there be a winner?
Yeah, it's a huge disruption. I mean, what China did extremely well, starting in 81, 82, when they started opening up their free trade zones, is enable a dramatic transfer of technology. But that's a huge motivation for the Chinese Communist Party leadership at the time, many of whom are engineers. They wanted to get Western technology as fast as possible into China, and then start copying it and producing their own domestically. And they've done that. So John was quite right to say they've done it. They got away with it because American corporations are willing to screw their workers to take on the higher profits they get by having their much more lowly paid Chinese workers. Of course, now that that's been successful to the scale that it has, China's gone from being, you didn't even bother counting it in global GDP calculations back in the 1970s. It's being a bit facetious, but not too much. To now, it's probably the world's largest economy. So you can't continue doing the same thing as the world's largest economy that you did as an also-ran. And that's why, in that sense, Trump has a point. But the way he is definitely labouring the point.
Yeah, of course, it has been beneficial to both sides, hasn't it, really, until now? I mean, you could argue that the prosperity of both countries has been built on this trade arrangement, and now it's being pulled apart. It's being felt.
Yeah, I mean, it's what's actually happening. Of course, we're having we basically had a web of corporations that's independent of the chessboard of countries. And this is our problem. We still manage the economy in terms of the chessboard, but it's overlaid by this enormous web. And what is happening with Trump now is he's cutting the web in various places, or making movements along that web much more expensive than they were beforehand. So if you look at in terms of an iPhone, I'm not sure how many different countries involved in making components for the iPhone, but I think it's over 50 different countries are involved. Now, if you start whacking tariff barriers up, which increase the price of those components, if you're exporting them, there's tricks you can play if you're doing stuff inside the one company. Using variations of transfer pricing, you can get around the impact of the tariffs that way. But generally speaking, it's disrupting those global supply chains, and that's meaning it's much harder to produce goods. It's much harder to export them, and you're having a collapse in business. You're having companies being sent bankrupt by it. So it is incredibly disruptive. And there's no, I'm not a fan of free trade, as you know, but this one has gone on so long and become so destructive that, yes, it is having an impact on the global economy.
Yeah, and as I said in the introduction, as lots of people say, nobody wins in a trade war. So Are they right in that, or if they hang on long enough, could there be an ultimate winner?
Well, I mean, there has been one of the best books on this is actually by Michael Hudson called "America's Protectionist Takeoff," and this is America building its industries in the 1800s, largely by putting up tariff laws deliberately intended to stop imports from Europe, particularly England, and force the goods to be manufactured domestically. And as Michael argues, that led to an enormous amount of investment, domestically financed out of the domestic monetary system. You didn't need to import English pounds to do it. And you had to build up the technology over time. And given the scale of the American economy and its rate of growth of its population and land area, as well as that was expanding in the 1800s, and the market that existed for things like railroads and so on, then that meant that though the American steel manufacturing started behind the English and then ultimately the German in terms of capabilities, it became ultimately the strongest on the planet. And again, this pattern is repeated in countries like South Korea. One reason South Korea dominates telecommunications these days, so it plays a much, much larger role than you'd expect from the size of its economy, was its government decision, I think back in the 1980s, to say that everybody, or not in the 1990s, everybody had to have a T1 connection, and not built by the government itself, but by the telecommunications companies. That's where things like Samsung came from.
Yeah. But even those companies, though, are using supply chains which go over many countries.
Yeah,
so I mean,
right.
so that argument of comparative advantage, which I know you don't like, is that happening in the technology space? Because we've got complex technology products where people are, you've got chip manufacturers in certain countries, you might have screens being made in other countries. You are getting a bit of specialization, and to replicate the whole thing and say, well, we're going to do all of this in our own country. The US is going to do all of it. We're going to make all of iPhones in the United States. It's never going to happen because the horse is already bolted.
Well, I mean, the horse this is what Trump is happening, is to force the horse back. But of course, the horse that comes back will be very different to the one that went out, because the level of labor involved in producing these goods is dramatically lower now than it was 30 years ago.
He might want people are used to buying a thoroughbred, and they're going to get a mini Shetland. Is the
well, they're going to get a high tech horse that doesn't need a rider, and that's the issue, that when you bring this technology back on, it isn't the technology that went away with its labor capital ratio that existed then. It'll be one with a much lower labor capital ratio that if it does come back. And that also, to some extent, you've got to build the skill base up. So
yeah.
One of the points Tim Cook made some years ago, which was quite valid, is if he wanted to have a meeting of all the machine tool experts in America, he could hold it in Apple's boardroom. Going to have the same meeting in China, you'd need a football stadium. So the skill base has been eroded as well, and rebuilding that skill base is not an overnight task. So these things, even if it's effective,
an impossible task, you might say.
Yeah, not impossible, but something which takes 10 to 15 years to do, and he wants results tomorrow.
Yeah, and in the meantime, you've got a trade war going on, because he's putting in place protectionist measures to make that happen, and as we're seeing, everyone is suffering as a result of that. So why is everyone suffering if it's not if it's a chessboard, you're just moving the parts around, somebody's got to win, but it looks like nobody is winning. So global trade is down for everybody as a result.
Yeah. I mean, you're cutting off supply chains. You're making it more expensive to trade. You're making it, you're making it possible to do something while not making the replacement is going to take much longer than the cutoff that you've imposed. So it's going to reduce the capability of production. It's going to cause exports to fall globally, and that's what seems to be happening.
Right. So you're not going to get, so the US is not going to race into creating their own domestic alternatives, because the demand's not there, because demand has subsided so much.
Well, it's been not a great deal of subsidence in demand. What's the cost issues of trying to do all that technology domestically? Ultimately, you'll be able to do it as cheaply as you can in China, but that's a 10 to 15 year case of training up your workforce, bringing the machine tools back on board, developing new technology to replace what was done in China and places like Foxconn. You couldn't bring Foxconn labor, even given how authoritarian America tends to be towards working class. You couldn't bring Foxconn practices into America. Forget it. So there are enormous barriers in doing this, and if iPhones might increase in price by a factor of 2 or 3 if you try doing it. So it's just not going to happen on the scale that Trump wants it to happen.
Well, sounds like Donald Trump might be living in La La Land. Who'd have thought it? Look, if you want to hear this podcast in full, you can go to debunkingeconomics.com and listen to it there, or become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof. Steve Keen. Subscribe there and get access to this and all the other podcasts in this series. I'm Phil Dobbie. He's Steve Keen. We'll see you back here again soon. Thanks for listening.